Well, today I have Dr. Joel Garrod, a sociologist based in Canada. And I have him on today because he wrote this really interesting paper based on, talking about blockchain and specifically talking about the property relations within blockchain and its relation to capitalism. And it was just really interesting. It caught my eye, and I really had to have him on and talk to him about his thoughts on the paper. So thanks, Joel, for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So you wrote this paper, right, about blockchain and the relationship to property, or I guess relation to property relations. And I really liked it because it, I think, succinctly brings up the point about how current analyses around blockchain in academia and elsewhere tends to fall a little bit short and doesn't go quite deep enough when thinking about blockchain and its relation to capitalism, and they tend to not ask the right questions, and therefore, in my opinion, I think they don't make the right conclusions, and this is in particular with people who are writing these papers probably are left-leaning based on what they're saying. But I think they miss a little bit of some of the nuance that I think that you got pretty well in the paper. So thank you for writing it.
You're welcome.
But maybe to start, before we talk about the actual paper itself, I'd be really interested to hear from you how, as a socialist, what originally drew you into blockchain and got you interested in it.
Sure. So I was aware of Bitcoin when it first emerged, but it didn't, for whatever reason, didn't really interest me at the time. I wasn't a sociologist of money, so I wasn't really that curious about it. But then kind of, I guess, when Ethereum started to emerge and the concept of smart contracts became a little bit more wider known, maybe around like 2014-ish, at least for me. I kind of came upon that, and that's when I really started to get interested, mainly because a lot of my work is historical, and it tends to kind of look at the past to see how a lot of struggles have led things to the way they are in the present, and thus where we might see things going in the future. And so knowing that kind of the application of contracts to lots and lots of things is kind of fundamental to capitalism, particularly labor contracts and those sort of things, I started to get very interested in this kind of world of the blockchain, so to speak. And I wrote an earlier paper, I think it came out in 2016, called The Real World of the Decentralized Autonomous Society. And that paper was kind of a result of looking at kind of just being like in the online space related to blockchain stuff. And, there's a Facebook group called Decentralized Autonomous Society. And I started just interviewing some people and chatting with them. And that what I kept kind of finding, at least in that paper, was that everyone had this very like utopian vision of how blockchains were going to work and that it was going to solve all these problems. But what I noticed was that when I was talking to a lot of these people, they really kind of, it's like they kind of had like half of an understanding of how capitalism worked. And then they were kind of missing this other half that actually would probably lead their utopia to be a little bit more of a dystopia, actually, if we got there. So it was that first paper where I wasn't planning on doing more studies into the blockchain or things like that. It was just kind of a one-off. But then when I did that, I started getting a lot more people contacting me and kind of just being like drawn kind of further into the community. And similarly, at the same time that I was kind of just, keeping my eyes and ears open and just trying to take in everything that was in that community, that's when I kind of started to notice that there was a larger like academic literature on the blockchain that was also starting to emerge. And so when I first wrote that paper, on the property of blockchains, like its very first version was actually just going to be looking at what big corporations, in particular financial corporations, were doing with the blockchain. Because at the time, I felt that, looking back to that earlier paper, I was kind of going, okay, I think what these people are missing are the way that the corporate sector is going to be using blockchains, and thus that's actually what needs a little bit more investigation. But then when I started to do that, I found that most corporations are still trying to figure out how they're going to use it, right? And basically, when you look at the ways that they're trying to use it, it all kind of boils down to either reducing their overhead and automating things that use human labor, essentially. And so for banks and other things, basically they're using it to replace their old legacy tech infrastructures and things like this. But it wasn't that interesting, to be honest. And so it was kind of at that point where I decided to shift to looking a little bit more at that academic literature, because again, it just seemed like there was this massive stuff coming out on kind of both sides of, let's say, a right and left spectrum of politics. But I just felt that a lot of what people were writing about either rested on kind of their hopes or their fears, and that they weren't actually doing kind of empirical analysis of like what is actually happening. And so that was kind of where I just started to think, like, how could we start to develop a different sort of way of looking at blockchains, and maybe like a kind of future framework that we could use to start actually doing more empirical research on kind of the larger transformations, like in terms of how blockchains might transform the state or just the larger global political economy, like capitalism, things like that, rather than, because some people are doing some very close case studies of maybe particular chains or things like that. And I don't know, I tend to be more broad focused. So yeah, those are kind of the things that were leading me into it. And then that's kind of what's kept me in so far, is this kind of constant stream of stuff that keeps coming out that forces me to have to go back and do more and more research and keep going. So
yeah, and I'm curious, what type of responses have you seen since you've published this paper?
Yeah, pretty good. I mean, every now and then you just get some people contacting you, being like, hey, I really agree with you. That's like the first thing I've seen, kind of similar to yourself as well, saying that at the beginning.
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah. And then, I had other academics that were working on the blockchain who kind of had similar criticisms. And so it was nice to actually kind of connect up with some of them. And so we were supposed to have a big conference about it in July, I think in Amsterdam, but obviously that is not happening anymore. So we'll maybe have a virtual conference about it. But yeah, so it's been pretty good. But I mean, my presumption is in this case that, that's just because the people that like it are sending me emails, and all the people that don't like it probably are just ignoring it or something like that. I'm not getting any hate mail or anything. So.
Okay, nice. Yeah, I think
at least not yet.
yeah. Maybe if it gets a little bit bigger, they'll come out of the corners.
Exactly.
Or out of the shadows. No, that's really cool to hear. I think I hope it's getting some of the other academic stuff that I read, at least those authors, to think about it a little bit differently. But so going into the paper, you define property relations as they exist right now. So then what would that potentially look like under some form of socialism? Like, what is the property relations right now under capitalism, and what does, socialist texts, what do they propose as an alternative, as a way to sort of have the definitions right when we talk about some other things in the paper?
Sure. So I think first off, we just have to clarify what we mean by property, because I think both on all sides of these sort of debates, there's a lot of confusion about this concept, because we tend to reify it in capitalist societies. We think of property as things, because, of course, that's our reality. But more specifically, property usually in a more legal sense refers to rights in or to things. And so that means that there can be different forms of property, right? So you can have private property, you could have state property, or you could have common property, and you can have lots of different ways of organizing some of those different forms of property. But of course, when we're talking about capitalism, it's typically defined as a system in which there are private property rights in the means of production. So in other words, not just your personal property, but you can own factories and a river or things like this, right? Big tracts of land. And thus the emergence of capitalism is that point at which private property starts to dominate, feudal or other property forms. So you start to have, for example, enclosure movements and things like that kick all these peasants off their land. So now they're forced to work for a wage and yada, yada, yada. The rest is history. So to me, that's really the core of capitalism is private property relations. In other words, a system of exclusive rights to things, and in particular, the things that we need to survive, the things that we need to reproduce ourselves as a society. And so that's kind of, for me, the private property side. But again, there's other property forms. There's state property. So even in capitalist societies, the state has very particular rights to a lot of actual stuff, So for example, in Canada, we have something called Crown land, which is land owned by the state. And there are very particular rights that are related to that land, but ultimately the state kind of owns it. And then you can go down the line to something like common property, which essentially means that you can't exclude people from it, right? That everyone, insofar as that community decides who the people that have access to it are, you can't exclude like specific people, right? So some people will define things like social rights to, let's say, healthcare. Like we have universal healthcare in Canada. Some people would define that as a form of common property, albeit in this case mediated by the state, because the state's the one that administers it. But ultimately, it exists as a kind of non-exclusive right. Like everyone who's a Canadian citizen gets access to the healthcare. There's no other determinant factors, right? So to me, that's kind of, if we think about, like, let's say the goal of where we want to go with a socialist society, to me, that society looks like one that the dominant property form is common property, and primarily common property in the things that we need to survive. And I think that's an open question. I think we've, the older Marxist language of means of production maybe is still valid here, but I think we could add in lots of other things that we might not consider the means of production. Like for me, having healthcare that as a common property, I think that's a thing that we should have, education, and increasingly things like internet access, clean water, shelter, clothes, lots of things like that. So I think it's more that idea that you can't actually exclude people from these things. They get them just as a right of being part of that community. And I mean, if we want to go the full extension of that, that's the human community. And, the hope would perhaps be that we could even extend that those rights to non-human entities as well, including maybe animals, certain parts of the environment, and certainly in particular countries, they've tried to do that in terms of the environment. But that's kind of where I would go with in terms of property.
Yeah. So going from a system of private property to common property is more or less at a high level what socialists would like to see.
I think so, at least how I would define it. And I mean, ultimately, it just comes down to the fact that, as it stands today under capitalism, we basically let a birth lottery determine a lot of our position in life. And that impacts so many other things about our personal relationships, our health, our ability to express ourselves in a way we see fit, et cetera, et cetera. And to me, I don't know, given the productive capacity that we have in society today, it makes no sense to me that we can't feed everyone, that we can't give people adequate shelter, that we can't give them clean water. Right. Like in Canada here, for example, we have indigenous reserves that haven't had clean drinking water for almost a decade in some cases. And we're a supposedly first world country, right? So those are the sort of things that I see as really quite easy fixes. But of course, there's lots of things standing in the way of that. So
yeah, one of those being private property.
You got it. Exactly. Yeah.
All right. So we have our definitions down, but so one of the sections that I want to talk about, I think it was somewhere in the beginning, was you have this hopeful supporter section.
Mhm.
So you touch on something that is really prevalent in the blockchain space, especially from idealists, and it's this idea that blockchain is just sort of this thing to trade, track, and transfer money, goods, and services in a freer way or in the most free way possible, and therefore will finally create, the ultimate form of capitalism where I don't know, we're in heaven. And this is the only true pure capitalism that was ever meant to be. But so that's a really interesting point because this sort of sometimes people like to think that utopianism is like a left-wing thing or like a socialist thing, but there's also sort of like a utopian capitalism idea pretty prevalent in blockchain, which is of course annoying for me, but I was curious if you could expand a bit on some of your observations with that in your research.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, part of my research at a certain degree is always to look at, what people say about a thing, like the narrative that they're painting it with, and then what is actually perhaps the reality, right? Or maybe another way of putting this is kind of in the terms of the sociologist Bruno Latour is looking at matters of concern rather than matters of fact, right? So what are these things, these problems that people keep circling around? And in this case, you kind of keep seeing a lot of people saying, that, like, I don't think anyone would argue that, like, at least in the blockchain space, that capitalism today is great, right? It seems like regardless of the political position, no one's really satisfied with what's happening today. And so these hopeful supporters to me are various groups of people that come from a variety of different areas within the blockchain community, including the corporate sector, but also academics, also just people that maybe own a lot of Bitcoin or even have just started to tip their toe into the blockchain space, and they're not some big powerful actor or something like this. But there seems to be this kind of idea that if we could really just own our own stuff, including our data, including our identity, including anything, that really we would have this freedom that was supposed to be part of capitalism all along, right? Like it's kind of almost like a return to the emergence of capitalism and some of the discourses against the state and state seizure of property and things like this. And it's almost the dream, a kind of renewed dream, but in this new kind of technological clothing, let's say, to be like, if we could just own it all and the government wasn't there, then really we would be free because I could do what I wanted with all the stuff that I own. And, of course, I think when you kind of investigate that a little bit deeper, it starts to be maybe not something that's going to happen. And that actually that dream, whether it's a valid one or not, perhaps doesn't even matter given the way that things will develop by virtue of, I think, the way capitalism actually is, like the way that capitalism actually works today. And that's something that's also impacting this development. Because I think they almost see, like, the hopeful supporters see the development of a blockchain almost like side by side with existing capitalism, as if we're going to jump rails and then we're going to get on the good track and things are going to be perfect. But instead, it's all the same track, right? So it's like, it's going to be a lot messier than they think. That utopia will never arrive. Utopias never do. They're always, compromised in some way, or they transform a little bit. And so I think this strange version is just kind of a repeat of something that we've had before, but in a term, in kind of in global terms, right? Because there's this constant need to not only like protect, let's say, my money from the state or my data from big platform companies or whatever, but that I should also be able to do with my property, my private property, what I want across borders, right? So I should be able to, if I live in Venezuela or Iran or somewhere that has sanctions on it, I should be able to escape those sanctions. And that's kind of true freedom from the government and these sort of things, which, you know, is not, I don't think that in itself as an example is necessarily a bad thing, but they kind of use a lot of this language to legitimate this idea of like a global private property, that there can be forms of global private property that don't need states to enforce the property rights and to defend those property rights, and that really they're the ones in control, and that, you know, they're kind of relying on this older view of private property is allowing for, and this is like an older liberal view, but allowing for kind of some form of equal exchange, right? That, like, you know, if you think about like contracts and so on, liberalism and thus capitalism are kind of founded on this idea that, you know, the worker and the employer enter into a contract that is just a voluntary exchange, right? And that they're making the choice. But of course, when you actually get down to the reality of it, well, I mean, if your choice is to sell your labor for a wage or starve, as Noam Chomsky once said, you know, that's not really a choice. It's kind of a choice that is just wrapped around a form of exploitation, right? So I think that's something that with a lot of this hopeful supporter kind of discourse kind of, you know, kind of veers down that side. Like they think everything is just going to be this equal transaction and voluntary without looking at the actual violence or exploitation that might be inherent in some of those associations.
Yeah, it's a super common feeling that, in at least for me, like I sympathize a bit in the sense that it's anti status quo, which, I mean, I think most people are sort of sick of the status quo as it is. It's just sort of the conclusions that they make are a bit, you know, obviously wrong, I guess, from our point of view. Another thing I wanted to talk about, because there's this interesting anecdote that you briefly brought up in the paper, was about the countercrime branch of Public Safety Canada asking you some blockchain advice. So I thought that was pretty funny because, I mean, these hopeful supporters they're generally they just focus entirely on state sort of exploitation in a way. And sort of ignoring the ones that are inherent to capitalism in general. So I thought it was pretty funny that this security institution, for I understand, that reached out for you about blockchain. So I was curious how that went and how you responded.
Well, it was a pretty short conversation because they wanted to know how blockchain could be used in community policing, and I have no idea how I could use outside of something that would be horribly dystopian that I wouldn't want to ever live in. So I didn't want to give anyone any ideas by saying that. But yeah, I think there's kind of this like I mean, to just go back to kind of the broader, like, let's say libertarian or neoliberal themes and kind of ideas that tend to underpin a lot of the hopeful supporters of blockchain technology, is that there's kind of this idea that you can, like, they kind of always, they lack what I would consider like an adequate understanding of the origins of private property. Because I mean, their whole thought system, everything relies on private property being this kind of inalienable right that we exist. You know, we could take this from someone like John Locke, who says, you know, God grants us an original right in our person, meaning that we are private property, and thus it's kind of a God granted, or it's a natural right. It's given to us just by virtue of existing. But they never actually do any historical analysis of the emergence of private property, which, when you do that, it's super violent, it's super exploitative. You know, it involves basically both internal and then eventually external forms of colonialism and all the violence and stuff that goes along with that. And so the part of this issue is that then when they see this stuff emerging and they see the kind of utopian side that, hey, we could have money without states and all these sort of things, they're also neglecting the reality that, like, right now states are like, hey, how can we use blockchains? Like, and, you know, they might not even, like, it's not like the government in this case necessarily even has some nefarious thing. You know, it's not like people working in the civil service of various nation states are evil, nefarious people. They're just like, hey, I heard blockchain is like a thing that's new these days. Like, hey, I wonder how I could apply that to my little area that I work in. And so I think that's actually for a lot of those people, we can talk lots, let's say, about capitalists and projects by big corporations to use blockchains and maybe for surveillance or things like that. But I actually think how this is going to play out is in a much more kind of innocuous, banal way of just people trying to apply blockchains to random problems. And then, next thing you know, you're in like a blockchain mediated dystopia where everything is controlled by smart contracts, and so I think that's kind of something where, like, with this guy asking me about community policing, like I'm sure he was just like, oh, I heard about blockchains and you wrote this article, like, do you have suggestions? And no, I did not.
Yeah, that's really, it's probably a guy who was interested in Bitcoin and just wanted to get some advice on
He
trying
wants
to apply
to look
something
good
like
for his manager, He's like, I want to come in with like cool new tech solution that you could waste a lot of time on.
That's fair. He tried.
Exactly.
So you mentioned a little bit about this earlier in terms of contracts that so in the paper you mentioned that it was an important invention for the evolution of capitalism, and it facilitates sort of the smooth transfer of private property. It's pretty interesting that that you say that, because if we want to think about blockchain within the realm of some sort of alternative like socialism, still the idea of smart contracts are there and they exist and you can use them if you want to. So I was curious if you think that this history, like the fact that contracts were important for that type of transition or evolution, has anything to say for a transition away from capitalism as well. Like does socialism mean that contracts don't exist, or is that like some sort of type of exploitation inherently, or does it matter, like the details matter, I guess?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, I guess I would say a few things about it. First off, that there are lots of examples of contracts prior to the emergence of capitalism. However, they tend not to be contracts necessarily the way we think of contracts today, about like, a labor contract or things like this. So it was more a shifting of existing contracts to what we might consider today to be more explicitly economic kind of relationships or functions. I mean, there wasn't exactly legally the same sort of contracts that we have, but if you go back into feudalism or you go back to ancient Rome, there's certainly forms of contractual relationships. Usually during those periods, you had to transfer something to be like I will give you this coin to signify the transaction and to symbolize that there is like a contractual relationship or something like that. So you have some weird kind of examples like that. And I mean, you could also think about even like vassalage in feudal times as kind of a form of a contract. And and that got really weird too, where you'd have to like, the king would like put his hands over you and then you'd kiss each other on the mouth sort of thing, which tends to be, we've lost that in our modern understanding of feudalism. But, if we go, let's say we bring that up to the present, contracts are everywhere, right? Like you literally can't do something within a day where you're not engaging with some form of contract, particularly online. Like we all know the terms and conditions that we all scroll to the bottom of and then click accept.
Yeah, I read every single word.
Yeah. Well, then you have a lot of time on your hands.
I gotta know exactly what is going on down there.
Yeah, which is true, because then of course you get a lot of people that will be like, hey guys, this thing that you're doing on Facebook, if you actually look at the little contract you're signing, you're giving away way more information than you thought you were, just to have like a funny quiz on your Facebook profile or something.
Did you know though, if you post that one really long post saying Facebook is not allowed to take my data, then you're protected?
Yeah, that's the idea. I always think that's funny too, this idea that like all contracts are somehow valid, that like if I just say that that's like a contract. It reminds me of in, I think, The Office, where Michael Scott, he just steps out of his office and he goes, I declare bankruptcy. And then they're like, that like you can't, that's not what declaring bankruptcy is. You actually have to like fill out paperwork. And it's like, oh, okay. And so I always view people doing that on Facebook or somewhere else, like the same sort of situation. But yeah, like we have contracts all around us today that essentially mediate what, for the most part, are some form of exchange of private property, right? And usually in the online space, it's increasingly like our data or our information or something about that, where we're basically being like, yeah, you can take it. That's cool. Do what you want with it. And we're going to use this service. And so I think when we're thinking about moving forward, let's say into a post-capitalist society, if that is a socialist one, which would be my preference, it becomes a little bit stickier because on the one hand, nothing really in a way is new. Like all the different forms that we come up with to do things, they're often kind of a transformation of an older form. Like, so for example, if you want to study the emergence of capitalism, you essentially end up eventually finding yourself going back to all these people way earlier than you ever would have thought possible, trying to mesh like canon law and Roman merchant law together in interesting ways to try to figure out how you can have like a smooth transfer of what eventually becomes private property. So in that sense, my guess would be that unless we have some sort of situation that is such a radical break that we are like, we need all new institutions, we can't have anything that has a residue of capitalism on it, then it will probably be different. But my sense is that that's not really how history and just life works. So my guess would be that society would be a transformation of existing forms. And so in that sense, I do see a place for contracts because, I mean, I always think about something like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the idea of the social contract. But of course, as you know, when I first read this when I was an undergrad, I was like, what? I've never signed a contract. Like, we didn't all sign a contract to live together. And so in that sense, okay, that's maybe not a good way to like legitimate liberalism, but we could actually think about doing those type of things and having contracts like that provide, let's say, the certain values or principles that we want in a socialist society and embed them in certain contracts, right? I mean, just like a lot of things, you can use them in different ways and you can transform the roles that they play. I mean, we could even say this to a certain degree about the state, although some people would disagree. Because I mean, on one hand, the state is that thing that kind of allows capitalism to exist, but at the same time, at a particular period, for lots of very specific reasons that even include keeping capitalism itself up, it granted lots of social rights to healthcare and education and, workers' compensation and employment insurance and all these things to allow for, the welfare state in that golden age of capitalism in the mid 20th century. So I'm maybe not as let's say, willing to say we need to throw everything out and we need to kind of have a radical, strong break. I actually think it's more about just transforming what exists. And I mean, part of that is embedding socialist values and principles into some of those things, right? I mean, states could just as easily today kind of enforce social rights as the predominant form of property rather than private property, right? And they could say, hey, everyone gets shelter. And, a lot of that doesn't, like in the actual making of it, yeah, it gets complicated. But I mean, if, for example, I'm Canadian, if you look at the Canada Health Act, it's like 6 or 7 pages long, and it's just a list of like principles. It's not anything great. It's not some big like complex manual about how to create a healthcare system. It's literally like, what are the values that we're putting into this to allow that system to work? And I mean, you can do it with anything. So that's kind of my sense about how contracts and property and these things will work in the future. But of course, any sort of prediction is going to fail. So
yeah, of course. But I think some thoughts that came up. I guess the way that contracts are used under capitalism is for like private property relations for the most time. But then I guess you could argue that there is, in a way, a contract whenever you are dealing with common property as well, in a way. Although it's not like a written normal type of contract where you need everyone's signature. And so there's sort of like a inherent implication in interacting with common property as like a member of such a society, I guess.
Yeah, so I mean, that's where I think the notion of like democracy, or to maybe put it in like Foucauldian terms, a democratic governmentality might need to emerge, where, you know, we need to think about ways in which we can still have forms, let's say, of certain forms of authority. And I don't mean that in a negative sense, but rather in terms of maybe expertise or something like that, but that is still democratically figured out and determined. And so in that sense, you know, like a good example would be someone like Eleanor Ostrom, who's an economist who won a Nobel Prize for studying common property, right? And because she was kind of responding to this older idea of the tragedy of the commons, right? That has become the kind of basis for kind of modern libertarian and neoliberal thought, is this idea that when you have a common property, it's always going to get overexploited because there's nothing keeping in check people from exploiting it because it's common. We all have access to it. So someone, basically this in like more modern terms is like the freeloader problem. Like someone's going to be freeloading and taking more than they deserve from this thing.
Why should I pay for someone else's healthcare?
Exactly. Yeah. And it gets people on the right like really angry. They're like, oh, someone's using that thing that is mine too, but they're using too much of it. But when Ostrom actually started to examine actual examples of common property and common property governance, she found that no, actually, common property, that tragedy never happens because the people that have some interest in that common property, which, you know, is essentially like whatever the definition of the community is that uses that property, they basically figure out ways to manage it themselves, right? And they're typically democratic. They typically change over time because obviously circumstances change, how its use changes. So there's all these sort of things that go on that actually allow for a much more democratic process, and then also to still have everyone able to have access to that thing. And in many cases, that access or that governance might be about figuring out, okay, how much of this, let's say it's water, how much water can we use without depleting the well, right? And those sort of things, right? How can we actually have this be sustainable? So I think there's lots of actual examples of this in reality with real people, particularly, for example, in various forms of indigenous governance in various countries around the world. You know, indigenous people have been doing this since, you know, forever, and they're great at it, you know, and they manage to not create horrible wastelands of, you know, tailing ponds and other things and all these things that are related to kind of our horrible environmental practices. So I feel like that's kind of when we think about how to use contracts, and then maybe eventually we're thinking about how to use blockchains in some sort of socialist way to mediate all these things. It's really about figuring out some of those democratic mechanisms, which I know lots of people are working on right now, and then figuring out, okay, how do we actually apply them in a way that isn't based on an individual exclusive exchange of private property, which is kind of, I think, the common way a lot of stuff in the blockchain space is developing, but instead do it the other way, where it's like, could we use that stuff to actually democratically mediate our access to something that we all have access to, that we all have a right to, you know, that you can't exclude me from. But could we do that in a way where, you know, we're all able to share that thing? So, you know, a good example might be like, there's a lot of cases of like solar power being mediated by blockchains where someone's able to sell it to their neighbors or things like this. But I'm like, why sell it? You know, like, why can't we have a system where I just share the solar power with like my neighbors, and maybe they have something else that they could share with me, and it's mediated by like, you know, apps that are run on blockchains or things. So it's like, we don't have to have lots of meetings, we don't have to have talks, but it's kind of all automated, right? Like, I really want it's kind of a meme these days, but I really want that fully automated luxury communism. That's my view.
Yeah,
I
it's the
want that.
goal.
Yeah, and it's like we might as well move towards the things that we want. Obviously, we'll fall short, but hopefully we'll get some of those things.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting that you brought up Ostrom because right now, I don't know if you've seen in your research, but like quite a few of the different DAO projects out there have been referencing Ostrom in the commons space and thinking about using her research and developing different blockchain solutions. So I think it's a pretty interesting evolution that's quite recent in the blockchain space and using Ostrom. I think it's just a
Definitely.
part of the maturity process, I guess, away from the sort of utopian capitalism towards a more like a scientific view about these different
Yeah,
things.
and I mean, certainly her Nobel Prize helps.
Mhm.
But one thing I will say, like even about, a lot of people in the blockchain space that are, maybe those hopeful supporters, and they're maybe coming from a neoliberal or libertarian background or whatever. But I am actually very impressed by a lot of those people and their ability to actually, as much as they're reading like Hayek and whoever, they're also sometimes reading people like Ostrom and other stuff. So what I actually find very interesting about their kind of intellectual background is much more than a lot of other kind of areas. They kind of are just mishmashing stuff in, to me at least, strange ways that don't necessarily align with the politics, because
Mm.
obviously they're trying to solve problems and they're coming at it as typically like engineers and computer scientists and these sort of things. So that's something that I just think is a very interesting development that will maybe, as you say, maybe it's a maturing process. I don't know. Maybe it will reap positive, at least for us, dividends later, or maybe
Yeah.
not. Who knows? So
Yeah, we'll see. But I think it's an interesting development, and I hope what I found definitely with people in the blockchain space generally are pretty open to speaking about different types of political ideas, even if it challenges them,
mhm.
which I think it's pretty interesting when most of it is backed or sort of put into this framework of sort of free Hayekian sort of economic ideas. But so to get back to the paper, towards the end, you speak a bit about the different selves that are constituted symbolically through discourse as a form of property relation. So you mentioned, for example, the liberal, or I guess it'd be liberal possessive self, the
Mhm.
social self, the neoliberal self, which I think was pretty interesting ways of viewing like how capitalism evolved over time.
Mhm.
And then you refer to this guy named Robert Harian,
Yep.
who mentions, or yeah, I guess he sort of claims that blockchain is the ultimate neoliberal technology because of its ability to organize data. It encodes distrust between people, and it sort of leads to a new form of neoliberalism. And I can see sort of why he thinks that,
Mhm.
and I think there's a bit of truth to it. But then you had a really good response to that because if you go just like a little bit further in that analysis, he's missing a little bit of some of the other discourse that's happening at the same time, I think.
Mhm.
Because there are definitely neoliberal tendencies in there, but that's not just it. There's a bit of other stuff. So I was wondering if you could explain a bit more about what you mean towards the end. You say blockchain being a novel geography of the self in an age of globalization.
Sure. So first off, I'll say I actually really enjoyed Robert's book that some of my critique came from. But similarly, like with some of the other more critical authors I talk about in the paper, I found that a lot of it was kind of maybe, yeah, a little bit more future looking as to what could happen rather than what is happening. And that's where I
Yeah,
kind of want to keep binding us back to actual
reality,
things. Yeah. Yeah, well, I
or the
think he's
present, I
right,
should
but
say.
yeah, as you say, like there's some other spaces where those kind of discourses in the blockchain space, like yours truly, don't exist. So yeah, I think there's something there that needs to be examined a little bit more. And so in that phrase, this kind of novel geography of the self, the idea is kind of, again, like it's kind of related to private property in the constitution of ourselves as individuals, right? So I mean, under both law and in a lot of earlier liberal discourse, we're constituted as private property. And indeed, in many legal systems today, things like assault and so on are actually treated as such because it's presumed that you have a private property in yourself. And so if I go and punch you, I'm assaulting your private property and doing something to your private property, which you have in yourself. And so that sense of the self, that individual sense of ourself in that way, because of course, if we actually look further back in history, we find this modern idea of the individual actually fades away. And that surely, of course, people knew that they were different than the person next to them and so on, but they didn't really think of themselves as individuals the way that we do. They thought of themselves typically as part of larger either classes or estates or groups or status levels, things like that. And we're much more related in their conception of themselves in terms of that group. Whereas we, of course, think we're all amazing, unique snowflakes and that there's, we're the only one of us that exists and all that sort of stuff, which is, of course, also very related to capitalism too. But the development of that individual self happened in one case at the same time, I would argue, with the emergence of national identities, at least modern national identities tied to modern nation states. And so there's a sociologist called Craig Calhoun that points this out, and I think it's a very good point in that there's kind of those developments happening at the same time. It's not really an accident in a way because, one of the central kind of tenets of your national identity is that you engage with it just directly as an individual. It's not mediated necessarily through your family or like what religion you're part of or whatever. It's the idea that like if you're a member of that nation state, like you have that national identity, right? Like it's an individual identity, even though it's of course a group identity that covers lots of individuals. And so to me, this like the way that private property is developing, particularly in the blockchain space and this concept, because it's not just blockchain, I think this is happening elsewhere, but blockchain is a very potent example of it. It's, again, trying to spread private property relations across nation states. So in other words, borders should be increasingly meaningless for our exchange of private property. But then that similarly, I think, also kind of reflects on the self as well, that we start viewing ourselves as like, I'm not just a Canadian, let's say, that kind of like, I'm a citizen of the world. And so just as we're, a lot of people are fighting for this kind of global private property, I think it also speaks to a little bit of this sense of like, maybe not losing your national identity as, some like late 1990s globalization scholars thought it would, but rather that you shouldn't be restricted globally, right? Like I should be able to move freely around the globe. My property should be able to move freely around the globe, and that there shouldn't be those restrictions. And my presumption is that in doing that, because I mean, I think you start to see elements of this already in certain areas, but you start to see a kind of like almost transnational self emerging, like this idea that we're, with globalization, we're kind of almost moving towards a global society. And to me, that doesn't necessarily mean like one global government and we're all part of the same country, because that's, again, that would be like someone under feudalism being able to imagine a world of nation states, right? They couldn't have even imagined that the world would look like that. So I think we're kind of in that space where we're trying to figure out and see how things are going to transform at that level, at the level of the global political economy, but that's one that's also going to change the way we think about ourselves and kind of, again, even think about ourselves as we are as private property under existing legal systems and so on, and then how that eventually gets kind of transnationalized, so to speak.
Yeah. So when you say transnational, does that mean that sounds like it doesn't necessarily mean a rejection of your nationality, but also kind of just sounds like I'm I identify as my nationality just like whenever it's beneficial to me, and otherwise it shouldn't matter.
Yeah, I mean, who knows in reality? But I mean, I think a good example to a certain degree is, if you look, for example, at today's capitalist class, which some people argue is a transnational capitalist class today, and that we've kind of moved from a world of national capitalist classes kind of competing with each other to one where that still exists and that's still happening, but there's certain members of the capitalist class that are almost fundamentally transnational. And
Yeah.
this starts to actually kind of express itself in a lot of different sociological ways. So, for example, there was a book by Chrystia Freeland, who I think is our deputy prime minister here in Canada. But before she, joined the Liberal Party, she was a journalist. And so she wrote this book called The Plutocrats, The Rise of the Super Rich and the Fall of Everyone Else, or something like that. But essentially, given, she was a high level journalist, so she had lots of access to a lot of billionaires and their families, and, things like the World Economic Forum and other kind of very high level meeting places for billionaires and so on. And so the book is roughly all about her experiences with these people and interviewing them and just talking about their lives. And what she talks about in the book is, in a certain sense, this kind of transnational self that, at least for that class, is emerging. It's not emerging yet for us because we don't have the same mobility. But, you would have people that they were born in one country, they went to school in another, they own condos in, Paris, like Rio, London, wherever, multiple places around the world. They fly in private jets anywhere they want to go at, very easily. And they constantly meet at these certain like high level forums, again, like World Economic Forum or some others that aren't necessarily for work, but are more just play. And also engage with other people that have those similar types of backgrounds, right? That, their kids speak like 4 different languages because, again, you grew up here, maybe your nanny spoke this language and taught you this, and then you went to school here, and and so there's almost a kind of, to me, like, with at least that segment of class that is a little bit similar to like older ruling classes, like particularly if you think about like under feudalism, where, royal families, they wouldn't even speak the language of the people they were ruling over. Yeah. And they would often like, the lingua franca, of course, we get the term because French was the lingua franca for the nobility of Europe for, a couple hundred years, right? And so all the royals, regardless of even if you were a small noble in some backwater German, territory, you would still aspire to speak French and to model your dress as to what the French aristocracy was doing and all these sort of things. And so I think we see elements of that happening with the capitalist class today, but I also think there's kind of this desire, or at least movement towards, with, again, these people that see kind of Bitcoin and blockchain as being this like liberating force by allowing us to move and exchange private property everywhere around the world, that it's also kind of a self transformation as well, right? And I think you see this too when you like, for example, and we can talk about it in a bit, but that Dystopia Labs conference, there was one talk with people from Cuba, Venezuela, and Iran, talking about how, cryptocurrency can allow them to, let's say, move around what they consider to be brutal regimes. But part of that is also the sense of like being a transnational, it's like everyone else gets to use Amazon. Why can't I use Amazon? Right. So I think in that way, there's kind of a bigger transformation of ourself at foot, where national identity, it's maybe not getting unimportant, but transforming in a certain way that I can't quite put my finger on yet. But I think there's something there.
Yeah. It's a very dystopian thought to think that Amazon is the being able to use Amazon is the ultimate existence.
Yeah, the bearer of freedom is being able to buy things on Amazon.
One of the naive assumptions that I think a lot of crypto libertarians, like you're mentioning, a lot of these people, they make is that the blockchain will sort of automatically allow you to easily subvert national legal systems or like sanctions and just law in general sometimes. But you had this really good quote. And this is sort of a broader question from one of the users on the Discord channel, Samp805. I thought it was really interesting. But you said, if the poles of these perspectives on the blockchain have gone too far in either direction, then we might anchor ourselves with the ways in which the global emerges out the national, and the ways in which the self, through new forms of ownership, is emerging as transnational. So Samp805, he made an interesting point that this quality maybe could be conducive to a growing international class of consciousness and solidarity. Do you think that that's possible? Like, it seems pretty, like, it's something I would love to see, and like I think is really a good thought experiment to think about whether it's possible. At the moment, we see it mostly just as like rich people are able to do it.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I flip-flop on this myself. I would say that, the pessimistic side of myself says like, well, that would be nice, but it's probably unlikely. Yeah. However, that being said, I mean, again, if you look at the way that other kind of radical transformations of societies have evolved, sometimes it is those things that are moving in that particular direction that do allow for that wider consciousness to emerge, and that allow for, maybe not the sort of socialist utopia we want, but for more progressive things to happen. And so I do think that in kind of continuing the expansion of, let's say, a global consciousness, that there's benefits to that, particularly in terms of, at least for myself, things like common property, right? Like, I think, for example, when you have lots of places in the world that have, various levels of universal healthcare, when you have, like, let's say, that emerging, that kind of consciousness, it becomes very difficult to continue to legitimate, like, for example, the United States, a system of like private healthcare insurance, although somehow they're still able to keep legitimating that. I don't know how, but well, I do know a little bit, but I mean, so I think in that sense that, like that would be my optimistic sense would be to agree with is it Samp805?
Samp805, yeah.
Samp805, okay. But then what I also, in that quote, the notion of the global emerging out of the national, and this is a concept that comes from the sociologist Saskia Sassen, who is a globalization scholar. And essentially what that means, and kind of where I think it applies to the blockchain, is the idea that all the things that we typically call global or transnational, they don't exist in some global space, right? There's no like, it's like they're not in thin air, right? We all still live in a world of nation states. We're all governed by particular laws in those countries. Those national governments, they're, the enforcement wings of the state, like the police and the military, still operate, and those things are still in existence. Yet, of course, we see the development of certain forms of transnational capitalist activity, for example, or things like the platform economy, the rise of big platforms that, just like blockchains, are kind of, they seem inherently global, right? There's nothing necessarily that would restrict them from applying all over the world. And certainly for, companies like Facebook or Amazon or whatever, you can access them almost everywhere in the world, with the exception of, a small number of countries. So this idea that the global emerges out of the national in these kind of very material, concrete cases is one that speaks to the fact that for those things to work in this supposedly global way, it means they still have to deal with the reality of a world of nation states, right? They still have to adhere to national regulations, or they have to transform them, right? They have to, they have to use lobbying efforts in different countries to get what they want. Maybe there's a law that's restricting some aspect of the way that they want to do their business that they need to transform. So in the paper, for example, I use Uber as an example, where, in my country of Canada, the application of Uber across the country is all over the place, right? Because different provinces and different cities have different rules as to how that works. So it's not like Uber is everywhere, right? Even though it's kind of fundamentally or inherently global, in practice, it's not, right? There's lots of places where it doesn't operate. And that's because of this existing system of nation states, national institutions, laws, regulations, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, it's kind of more interesting to look at how those things actually get transformed to then allow for these, let's say, global or transnational spaces of accumulation to emerge. And so in the case of the blockchain, for example, like we were discussing earlier, as part of the that Dystopia Labs conference, there was a commissioner from the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States talking about blockchain and basically some of the struggles of regulating it and how they were really supportive and they wanted this to emerge and they wanted people to be using it, but it still needs to fit under the existing regulations. So how do we do that? And how, so there's this whole big system where, again, people are kind of circling around just like a problem, like, okay, we want the blockchain to work, but it needs to fit under the regulations and the laws. So how do we do that? How can we tweak them? And then, you get various Congress people or other people saying, no, we support blockchain, and they bring up things, in various governmental forums, right? And so that's like the way that this all emerges in terms of this global is actually a lot, let's say, lower to the ground than we think it is. And it involves all this kind of messy, people just trying to solve what they see as are just kind of concrete problems. But then, down the line, we actually see a radical transformation emerge, right? That totally changes how our existing, let's say, system of capitalism operates, and thus has lots of implications. And obviously for us, those are implications that relate to things like social justice and democracy, et cetera, right? So that's where that kind of quote and that concept is kind of speaking to in the blockchain space, and where I think maybe some of the other authors in that world, even though if they're quite critical scholars, I think sometimes they miss a little of that like we're in the process and this is all continually in process, and it's a matter of kind of fitting things to the existing system rather than creating something that's revolutionary or is going to cause this radical break. And it's actually the transformation in small little bits that eventually kind of leads to a huge overhaul. I mean, I think we only need to take the example of modern nation states, which, you only go back, in some cases, not even like 50 years from the emergence of those initial modern nation states to find out that they were actually absolutist monarchies, right? And that the boundaries of those countries were boundaries created by, a king and their family being able to conquer the land in a very specific territory. And then they start to emerge a kind of proto-state. And then whether there's a revolution or maybe in other countries, the monarchy kind of just gave way to capitalists and merchants and so on, and kind of was incorporated within it, places like England and so on, where you still have a monarchy, you didn't have a cut their heads off revolution. And so in that case, that whole political territory and the way that the state functioned, its actual role in terms of what it did in that community, like the rights it enforces, how it does that, all those sorts of things, transforms radically, right? When you compare like a capitalist nation state to an absolutist feudal monarchy, it seems quite different. Yet this one, like the borders and some of them in some cases are exactly the same. And it was actually this transformation of something that already existed. And so that's where I think with the blockchain, in terms of how it's getting incorporated today, that's a more likely scenario than some sort of big radical break or revolution or some killer app or DApp that ends up changing everything.
Yeah, I think there's always a bit of like a residue of the past whenever you're thinking about
exactly
how things exist today. But I can confirm from like personal experience at blockchain conferences, at I mean, in the corporate blockchain world, I mean, we constantly, I don't say we, but they constantly talk to authorities and like are always looking for ways to fit within the currently existing legislation, because I mean, I think there's also an inherent understanding that they are reliant on state authorities, and it is just in their interest to abide by those laws rather than trying to make something so radical and yeah, just completely separate themselves from how things just currently exist today. I mean, it would hurt their business, and so, yeah, it's all things in just like much smaller steps than I think the maybe crypto libertarians would like to think is actually happening.
Yeah, and certainly like that's the history of capitalism as well, right? Is this a much longer process that, we think about those big revolutions, but in actual fact, you have to go back many hundred years previously in the various places where those revolutions start to happen to start to see some of the dynamics, some of the kind of contests and struggles that would eventually play themselves out in that way. Where if we just focus on the revolution, we're kind of missing everything that led up to it for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And to me, that's actually the more important thing, because if we're looking to the future, then that means what are the little small indicators that we can start to see now that might later lead to something like that. And then, if we can highlight some of those things, how or in what ways can we then hope to maybe, shift the tracks a little bit and maybe do something that's a little bit nicer rather than the dystopia.
Definitely, that's sort of my thinking is that it's still so early in the game, and this stuff is still so new that I think we have an opportunity to have some sort of influence, at least from a socialist perspective. We can influence some of the levers at play at the moment if we organize ourselves.
Yeah, and some of that too is just like consciousness raising as well. I think like we talked about earlier, one of these interesting things is that a lot of these people that are maybe more neoliberal or libertarian or whatever they want to call themselves in the blockchain space, but that they're also now starting to look at a little bit more like, Elinor Ostrom or these other people. It's like that's part of that process too, right? So that's something where, for a lot of them, they might just not have ever been really exposed to a lot of socialist literature. And, they probably haven't read Marx in any great depth or at all. And, so I think that's something where, at least for those of us on the left, if we can be like, hey, actually, like they have some pretty good insights. Here are a few that maybe relate to the blockchain. Check it out. And then they do that and might be like, oh, yeah, that is true, So
yeah,
who knows, though?
We'll see. We'll try our best.
That's my optimistic side coming out.
Hey guys, so the interview that I had with Dr. Z Garrod was a pretty long one, so I split it up into two parts. The first one is what you just listened to, and the second part I'll be releasing next week. In that part, we talk more about human rights and sort of the differences between the liberal and socialist view on what human rights are and its relationship to cryptocurrency. And as well, we talk a bit about his other research interests, which is the history of the transition between feudalism to capitalism and what type of lessons we could learn from that. So if you've liked the interview so far, I hope you'll consider donating to my Patreon. With it, you get access to all the Patreon exclusive content and some special perks in the Discord channel. It helps me pay for the equipment and all the different services that I use to host my podcast and my articles and so forth. So it really helps a lot. Otherwise, it would be great if you can leave a 5-star review on your podcast platform that you use to listen. That way, the podcast gets pushed up to the front of the search engine. Thanks for your support, and catch you guys later.